Years ago, while I was working in my dad's home office, I came across an old typed letter in a folder on his desk. It was a copy of a letter my father had written to President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1968. It began with my father explaining to the president that he was a patriotic military veteran who believed in military service and U.S. efforts to protect America from communism. But then he got to his main point. Get out of Vietnam. Get out now. It's an unwinnable conflict. You need to stop throwing away American lives in a hopeless cause. Now, I don't know if Johnson ever read that letter. Probably not. But it's always stood out for me as a vivid example of how so many patriotic, Cold War supporting Americans like my father soured on the Vietnam War by 1968. You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
The government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
History matters because it's not just about the past. History's about us, here and now. It explains the world we live in and why things are the way they are. And history gives us insights into how to achieve a more just, peaceful, and prosperous future. So people, let's do this. Hello, everyone. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. I'm host Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, and this is In the Past Lane, episode 39, in which we explore the Vietnam War and speak with filmmaker Ken Burns about his new 18-hour documentary on the war that begins airing on PBS on September 17th. We are coming to you this week from the Agent Orange Studios, located on the campus of Holy Cross College in Worcester, Massachusetts. You can learn more about me, this podcast, and our guests at our website, inthepastlane.com. You can also follow me and keep up with news about the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Steering us clear of any quagmires and booby traps is the one and only Lulu Spencer, our executive producer. Well, here at In the Past Lane, I'm enjoying all the positive feedback I've been receiving from listeners in recent days. Thanks for taking the time to reach out via Twitter, Facebook, and email. I've especially enjoyed hearing from teachers and professors who have assigned In the Past Lane podcast episodes to their students. That is a total thrill. I've done this with my own classes, mostly episodes from other podcasts, like the terrific Ben Franklin's World podcast hosted by Liz Covart. And the student response has been overwhelmingly positive. They like the idea of offsetting traditional reading assignments with listening assignments. And honestly, I think this is the wave of the future. Podcasts will never replace reading books and articles, but they can broaden the range of ways teachers and professors can engage students in history and historical thinking. If you've assigned podcast episodes to your students, please let me know how it went, and if you plan to continue doing so. Thanks. So, what else is going on around here? Well, I'm keeping busy with my courses at the college, and as of this moment, 3 weeks into the semester, I'm still on top of things. By which I mean, the following has not yet happened. My office is not a wreck. My email inbox is not overflowing with 500 plus unanswered emails. And I'm not carrying in my backpack 50 ungraded papers that I should have handed back to students a week ago. So far, so good. Although you can probably hear it in my voice, heading back to the classroom has actually given me a bit of a sore throat. Got to work on those vocal muscles. I've got 2 more news items before I wrap up this intro. First, the annual Podcast Awards will be announced on September 30th, which is International Podcast Day, in case you didn't know. In the Past Lane is in the running for one of these honors, which are kind of like the Emmys for podcasting. So that's very exciting and also very nerve-wracking. We'll see. And finally, some sad news. As most of you know, at the very end of each episode's outro, a voiceover announces that In the Past Lane is a production of SBI, Snoring Beagle International, followed by 2 very deep beagle snores. Well, Molly, In the Past Lane's faithful snoring beagle, has passed on. We're saddened to lose her, but she did have a good run of 14 years, and she'll always be part of In the Past Lane. Okay, people, pack some extra pairs of dry socks. It's wicked hot and rainy in that jungle. Your journey in the Past Lane begins now. Ready for a quick quiz? A quiz about Vietnam? Don't worry, it's only 4 questions. Here we go. Number 1. How many people were killed in the Vietnam War? Number 2. True or false? Minorities served in disproportionately high numbers in the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam. Number 3. What percentage of soldiers who served in Vietnam were drafted? And here you get choices. 25%, 50%, or 75%. And number 4. What month and year did more than 50% of the American public decide that the Vietnam War was, quote, a mistake? Whenever I give this quiz to my students and general audiences, most people are surprised by how many questions they get wrong. So what are the answers? All right, let's walk through it. Number 1, how many people were killed in the Vietnam War? Now, most people answer 58,000, but this is a bit of a trick question. I asked for the total number killed, not just American military personnel. The total number includes over 2 million Vietnamese deaths. All right, how about number 2? True or false? Minorities served in disproportionately high numbers in the U.S. Armed Forces in Vietnam. That is false. The percentage of minorities who served in Vietnam was roughly equal to their percentage in the overall U.S. population. All right, what about number 3? What percentage of soldiers who served in Vietnam were drafted? This one always is a surprise. 25%. Now, what that means, of course, if you flip it around, is that 75% of those who served were volunteers. Nobody seems to get that one right. All right, number 4. In what month and year did more than 50% of the American public tell the Gallup poll that the Vietnam War was a mistake? The answer? August 1968. Many people find that really surprising. And that's because they assume that since the war became so unpopular, that disapproval by a majority of the American public must have occurred in 1966 or 1967. Nope. Up to August 1968, when there are over 500,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, and the anti-war movement has been staging huge demonstrations for 2 years, a majority of the American public still supported the war. Now, the war was never popular, but it only became truly unpopular over 3 years after U.S. ground forces entered the conflict. So this quiz kind of raises some questions, doesn't it? And the big one is, why are so many of us uninformed about a relatively recent war? Well, one reason is that Vietnam was such a controversial war, and controversy often causes us to turn away. By way of contrast, World War II was a popular war. Think of how many battles the average American could name. Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, or the Civil War. Gettysburg, Antietam, Vicksburg, Bull Run, Shiloh. How many Americans today could name a single battle from Vietnam? Not many. Another reason for our collective lack of knowledge about Vietnam is that it was a very complicated war. It was a civil war and an anti-colonialist war and a proxy war in the larger Cold War struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Probably the biggest reason for our collective amnesia about Vietnam, of course, is that the U.S. lost that war. Well, to counter some of that amnesia, ahead of my interview with Ken Burns, let's cover some basic background on Vietnam. Vietnam is located in Southeast Asia, and it's only slightly larger than the state of New Mexico. From the 1860s until World War II, Vietnam was a French colony. But in 1946, following World War II, Vietnamese nationalists, led by a Marxist rebel named Ho Chi Minh, launched the First Indo-Chinese War, and this was to achieve Vietnamese independence from France. Well, over the next few years, France did its best, with a lot of assistance from the U.S., to fend off the rebels and retain control of Vietnam. But in 1954, Ho Chi Minh's rebel forces defeated the French. Well, at that point, the United Nations stepped in and announced a ceasefire and a partition of the country. And this partition was a way of allowing the ceasefire to take hold and preparations to be made for transition to independence. The justification for this partition was that the people of South Vietnam favored a more pro-Western form of government. This was the region of the country most significantly transformed by decades of French colonization. In contrast, the people of Northern Vietnam, a more rural region where traditional Vietnamese culture still held sway, they favored the nationalist leadership of Ho Chi Minh. This partition was supposed to be temporary, lasting only 2 years until elections to choose a new government for a unified Vietnam were held in 1956. But the United Nations, under tremendous pressure from the United States, canceled those elections, and they did so out of fear that Ho Chi Minh would win. Remember, this is the Cold War, and the idea of a Marxist winning that election, even if it was the will of the people, was deemed intolerable by U.S. officials. Well, as the partition between North and South Vietnam seemed likely to become permanent, the the U.S. began to support the government of South Vietnam with money and military advisors. 4 years later, in 1960, the North Vietnamese, determined to create a unified Vietnam independent of Western colonial dominance, launched the Second Indochinese War. Thousands of North Vietnamese forces moved into South Vietnam, where they engaged in guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and assassination of South Vietnamese officials. And they were incredibly successful. By 1961, just 1 year into this war, the South Vietnamese government was reeling and in danger of collapse. So, President John F. Kennedy authorized the dispatch to South Vietnam of the first large contingent of military advisors. By 1963, the number of U.S. military advisors in South Vietnam topped 16,000. 2 years later, in 1965, Kennedy's successor Lyndon B. Johnson made the fateful decision to commit the first ground troops to Vietnam. By July 1965, 75,000 U.S. combat soldiers were in Vietnam. And the numbers just kept on rising. 385,000 troops by 1966. That's just 1 year into the war. 485,000 troops by 1967. 536,000 troops by 1968. And remember, Vietnam is just a little bit larger than New Mexico. And by 1968, there were not only more than 500,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, but the U.S. was suffering 1,200 soldiers killed per month. 1,200. That's 300 killed a week. Incredible. Now you can see why 1968 was the turning point year of that war. Now, it's important to remember the national mood at the time when Johnson first sent in those combat troops. In 1965, there was a tremendous sense of purpose and optimism. That feeling would eventually, 3 years later, turn to pessimism and opposition to the war. But in 1965, Americans were convinced that their nation was doing the right thing in Vietnam, and that it would succeed. One of those Americans was a young Marine named Philip Caputo. In 1965, Caputo was among the first U.S. soldiers to land in Vietnam. He would later write what is perhaps the best personal account of the Vietnam War from the perspective of an American soldier. It's called A Rumor of War, and I read this book in the spring of 1983 as a college freshman. It's a book that just blew me away when I first read it, and it's stuck with me ever since. In fact, my original copy is sitting right next to me as I speak. I teach on a regular basis a seminar called The American Way of War, and I always assign this book. And when I survey my students at the end of the semester for feedback on the readings, Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War is always the favorite book, by a long shot. I highly recommend you pick up a copy. One of the things that makes this book so powerful is that in 1965, Philip Caputo was excited to go to war in Vietnam. He felt a sense of patriotism and purpose. His generation was answering the call of duty, just like their parents had during World War II. And you can probably guess where the story goes from there. From brilliant determination to dark disillusionment. Caputo captures that brilliant determination in a passage at the beginning of the book. Let's listen. For Americans who did not come of age in the early 60s, it may be hard to grasp what those years were like. The pride and overpowering self-assurance that prevailed. Most of the 3,500 men in our brigade, born during or immediately after World War II, were shaped by that era, the age of Kennedy's Camelot. We went overseas full of illusions, for which the intoxicating atmosphere of those years was as much to blame as our youth. War is always attractive to young men who know nothing about it. But we had also been seduced into uniform by Kennedy's challenge to ask what you can do for your country, and by the missionary idealism he had awakened in us. America seemed omnipotent then. The country could still claim that it had never lost a war, and we believed we were ordained to play cop to the communist robber and spread our own political faith around the world. So when we marched into the rice paddies on that damp March afternoon, we carried, along with our packs and rifles, the implicit convictions that the Viet Cong would be quickly beaten and that we were doing something altogether noble and good. We kept the packs and rifles. The convictions we lost.
You are listening to In the Past Lane, the podcast about history and why it matters.
If you are enjoying this podcast, then please subscribe to In the Past Lane at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. Subscribing is free, and once you do it, new episodes of In the Past Lane are automatically downloaded to your listening device. Subscribing also gives you access to the entire back catalog of In the Past Lane episodes. And if you do subscribe, please leave a review. Thanks.
Ken Burns has been making documentary films for almost 40 years. It started with his Academy Award-nominated Brooklyn Bridge in 1981. Since then, Burns has gone on to direct and produce some of the most acclaimed historical documentaries ever made, including The Civil War, Baseball, Jazz, Lewis and Clark, The War, which is about World War II, The National Parks, America's Best Idea, and The Roosevelts, An Intimate History. His newest film, The Vietnam War, is a 10-part, 18-hour series, co-directed by longtime partner Lynn Novick. It debuts on PBS on September 17, 2017. It's an extraordinary film, maybe even Ken Burns' best work yet, and I highly recommend you view it. This film is sure to generate a lot of discussion, because Vietnam remains a raw topic for many Americans. I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to speak with Ken Burns about the film and what he hopes Americans will learn from it. I think you're going to find this interview really compelling.
Hello?
Hi, is this Ken?
Yes. Ed?
Yeah, this is Ed. Is this still a good time to chat?
I'm completely ready, and we've got, as I understand, like a half an hour?
Yeah, that works great.
That's terrific. I'm so glad.
So are you ready to go?
Yes, totally.
Okay, great. Well, I want to start off by asking you about the choice of the topic of the Vietnam War. On one level, people familiar with your catalog of your work, which is very extensive, everything from jazz and baseball, Lewis and Clark, and so forth, but also two important documentaries on war, the Civil War and World War II. In a way, the Vietnam War would seem like a logical choice, except for the fact that, in some regards, Civil War and World War II are, popular wars, at least popular or ones that elicit positive feelings among Americans in our historical memory, and that is not the case for the Vietnam War. So did that factor into the timing of your choice, and also the way that you kind of crafted the basic outline of the documentary?
Not at all, but it is important if there's something that we are not facing that's not a popular war that we dive in. I think the Vietnam War is the most important event in the second half of the 20th century, or the most important event in America since World War II. So we ought to be knowing about it, and we don't know about it because it was not a popular war. As you say, I think we tended to bury our heads in the sand about ostriches, or just remain in our hardened silos with our fixed opinions, one side or another. And I believe many of the divisions that we suffer today had their seeds planted in the Vietnam era. But having said that, none of that influenced our choice. Our choice was made towards the end of working on our World War II documentary at the end of 2006. It was about to be broadcast in the fall of 2007. And we just said, you know what? We have to do Vietnam next. Mm-hmm. And we've now spent more than 10 years plowing into a study of it. And we're benefiting, too, from the fact that there's been a significant passage of time, 42 years since the fall of Saigon, massive new scholarship and dozens of different specific areas of study, which have added, parts to our understanding, and a new openness with Vietnam and a new openness among veterans on all sides. And we felt it was hugely important to include all sides who are beginning to talk about it. And all of those things sort of conspired to give us certainly the most challenging production I've ever worked on, but easily the most satisfying production I've ever worked on.
You mentioned the many voices, and that's the thing that really stood out to me in the portions that I've watched, is the incredible diversity of voices, and especially voices from Vietnam, and also footage from the time period. I mean, that seems to be a fascinating story in and of itself, how you found these people and how you found the archival video and such. How did that come about?
Well, that's what we wanted to do. And Americans have traditionally talked about Vietnam, whether it's been in our popular Hollywood movies or even in documentaries, other things. We tend to talk only about ourselves. And we forget that there were two other sides, a winning side and a losing side on the Vietnamese side. And we felt that kind of triangulation, if you could engage them, would be terrific. we always do a deep dive in the archives. And in this case, we were able to avail ourselves with some Vietnamese archives, some Soviet archives, some Chinese archives, as well as hundreds of other archives from around the world. And that is a wonderful story of detective work and discovery and following leads and clues and word of mouth and spending time in the archives and not just taking the stuff that they have on the top of the table, but asking to have prints of the original negative from the camera rolls, et cetera, et cetera. And you're able to find extraordinary photographs and extraordinary footage with that kind of patience. But I think it's the fact that we were able to have North Vietnamese soldiers and North Vietnamese civilians, Viet Cong guerrillas, as well as ARVN, that's the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, soldiers, and Saigon civilians, and Saigon diplomats, and Saigon demonstrators, to complement the more than 50 Americans who populate the film, who represent the entire spectrum of American political belief and the entire spectrum of experience in the war, from POWs and Gold Star mothers to doctors to nurses to Marines to Army guys to helicopter pilots to fighter pilots to bombers to people against the war, protesters, draft resistors, the whole gamut, policy wonks, journalists, all of those people contributing to a narrative. And then there are 79 of those, and then you meet several dozen other characters archivally, the John McCains and John Kerrys, who we went to early in the process and said, look, we're not going to interview you, but your story is going to be in this. And so they become important archival stories, but we're not permitting familiar contemporary people to sort of be in the film. We want this to be mostly people that you've never heard of and might be somebody that you'd meet at a Thanksgiving or a party or a wedding party or something like that, sort of people in which they don't carry any baggage or may not in turn be trying to polish their apple in any way.
Right.
So John McCain's story exists in the film, as does John Kerry's story, but we're not letting them comment, nor did we interview Henry Kissinger. He's amply there in the tapes and other places. So we're very excited by this. And I think the thing to remember is that if you'd done a film on Vietnam, say in 1985, 10 years after the fall of Saigon, the U.S. was in a recession. All the talk was of Japan, the Pacific Rim. We were in decline, and Vietnam would be the symbol of that decline. It would be this ball and chain we would drag around through our history for the rest of our history, the signal of our decline. If we'd waited 20 years until 1995, we would be in the middle of the largest peacetime economic expansion in American history. We were the lone superpower. Vietnam would retain some importance, but it wouldn't be that ball and chain. Now, if you went ahead 30 years to 2005, Afghanistan and Iraq are happening. People are beginning to use the word Vietnam. We live in a much more complicated time, not free of the specter of mutually assured destruction, but of rogue terrorist states and of rogue actors. And of course, in the lee of 2001, Vietnam would take on a new significance. But if you continue to wait, you kind of go, hold, you're able to achieve a kind of perspective that transcends any particular mountaintop you happen to be on, looking back at those events. And you can kind of not average them out, you can incorporate them. And as I said, hopefully transcend them and offer people something in which this is not a polemic. We don't have our thumb on the scale here. We're just umpires calling balls and strikes, uninterested in making a polemical piece, and just try to wrestle to the ground one of the most complicated narratives I've ever come across.
And that did come across that in many ways you let people speak for themselves so that a viewer can really see how complex and how divisive many of these questions were. This is not a polemical treatment where one side is good and one side is evil. It's very complicated.
That's correct.
Very fraught.
And that's the way life is, and that's what you want to do. You don't want to say, oh, this person is right or that person is right. In war, there's more than one truth. And in this case, we tried to create a space in which lots of different perspectives can coexist without making any of them wrong. We just say, this is. And, a lot of people are out there in their hardened silos or ignoring it with arguments. Oh, if they'd only gotten rid of this general earlier and put in this general, we would have won. And those are just that, arguments. It's maybe a fun parlor game to wonder what would happen if the Confederates had won the Civil War, or if the Nazis and Japan had won the Second World War, but it didn't happen that way. And it is such a complicated story, Vietnam, that we just had to spend all of our focus and time just trying to get the facts right. In fact, after we finished the film, after we locked the picture, as it's called, while we were doing the sound editing and sound mixing and the onlining work to produce the finished product that everyone will see in September when PBS is broadcasting on the 17th, we would still say we'd change something here. We'd remove an adjective or an adverb because we thought that might unfairly appear as if we were putting a thumb on the scale. We'd learned that there were not 4 regiments of NVA that went down the Ho Chi Minh Trail that month, but only 3. So we would change that. The narrator would come back in and reread. And so we wanted to get the facts right so that we could have a strong foundation to sustain or to support all those differing points of view, because they aren't wrong. They are what people believe, and you can honor that without dishonoring the facts of the past.
Yeah, it's interesting. That came to me quite a number of times, and particularly when you think about, how could you summarize this 10-year-long war? And in many ways, it's a classic clash of American ideals. It's not good versus evil. You've got people that are signing up, volunteering to fight.
That's right.
In the name of democracy and human rights, and then people who are opposing the war, some people from the same family, in the name of democracy and human rights.
And Ed, you hit the nail right on the head, but it's really important that I communicate to you and to your listeners that this is not some sort of bland mediocrity here. This is not moral relativism. People do bad stuff, and we call them out on it. When the communists, for example, do a massacre, we call them out on it. When the Americans do a massacre, we call them out on it. When some Stalinist land reform causes starvation and death, we say that. When there are internal purges, we say that. When there's incompetence, we say that or show that or permit someone to present that kind of evidence. So this is not like saying, well, you could be morally relative, say, about slavery if we were talking about the Civil War. It's not that. It's just trying to say that we have for so long, 50 years, been fighting the Vietnam War between us, and that we ought to be able to step back, unpack what we think happened, and repack with what actually happened, and then try to have a civil discourse about it, not one that descends into shouting and yelling and blaming and the kind of typical left-right polemic that has polluted our discourse and has made our political scene so toxic today. The late historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said, we suffer today from too much pluribus and not enough unum. He was referring to events that were going on in the 1980s, but I sort of feel that my entire work, not just Vietnam, but everything I've done for the last 40 years has been about unum, how you have a shared story. And that's, I think, Vietnam will go a long way towards repairing if people will do me the extraordinary honor of giving their attention to this, will go a long way to promoting the kind of civil discourse, the kind of sense of national community and shared experience that we don't have today because everyone's an independent free agent and we all self-select our news and get what we want to hear, and have some place where we could potentially have a conversation together. I don't mean the national conversation. That's all kind of violin strings. I'm talking about allowing fathers and sons or granddaughters and grandmothers to have conversations about why they did this. Why did you protest the war? Why didn't you go? What happened when you were there, when you fought? What were your experiences? Why did you change? And why did you volunteer? And then why did you switch against the war? And why did that happen? And rather than make judgments against people, realize that wars can, very simply devolve into just conflict between armies, conflicts between tribes, conflicts between countries. When the most interesting thing, it seems, and Vietnam is this in spades, is the conflict within individuals. That you do meet soldiers who go and volunteer and serve their country with extraordinary bravery and at great sacrifice sometimes, physical sacrifice and psychological sacrifice, and then come home and begin to change. Or as you suggest, families are torn apart. Those are the things that are, to me, as interesting as the clash of armies.
Yeah. And as you say, thinking about that kind of national story and thinking about a nation in some ways as a family writ large, one of the most important things that any family, any kind of relationship has to go through is admitting failure, delving into the fraught moments and the hurts and things. And I think this is a great example where many of these things are uncomfortable truths, but if we only talk about the beautiful things and the happy moments, we're really not, we do that at our peril, I think, as a society.
Oh, Ed, you said it so eloquently and so beautifully. That's exactly right. We don't want to sanitize Madison Avenue, Morning Again in America kind of history. We want a real one that's rough and American and It's like a football coach, a high school football coach on Friday night or a college football coach on Saturday. They're just brutally honest. We stunk today. Our defense didn't do anything. We lost because we didn't do this. Americans are really good at taking stock. Unfortunately, in our political world, it has become so devolved that we're mimicking the media computer culture that we live in. Everything is binary, just a 1 or a 0. Mm-hmm. Everything has got to be black or white, red state or blue, right or wrong, young or old, gay or straight, north or south, east or west, rich or poor, whatever divisions we want to impose on this, with some idea that everything is simplistically, moralistically right or wrong, when of course we know it isn't. And we want to have those kind of conversations that understand that we are all deeply flawed creatures. Our religious teachings certainly remind us this, and our actions in our lives do. And so I think if we could have conversations of the kind we try to have as families, with the arguments, with the idea of working something out, rather than arguments just for the sake of argument, then we have negotiations that push us forward. We make progress as individuals, psychologically. We make progress as families together, emotionally. And we make progress as communities and states and nation collectively together. And we yearn for that kind of community, even though almost everything in our daily lives sort of plows us towards this simplistic binary unhappiness.
And part of that, I think, what operates there, and this is especially true in the Vietnam War, is a lot of mythology. I mean, there's many powerfully held myths about Vietnam. And did you consciously focus on not necessarily explicitly debunking things, but trying to take on some of those things head on? I mean, I'm just thinking one thing in particular that stood out was people have a sense that nobody supported the Vietnam War and that anti-war protests began right away, when in fact, polling data and front pages of newspapers, all of that can clearly indicate that a majority of Americans are behind the war for many years.
Ed, our process is just so different. We don't go consciously to debunk this. We just want to proceed through the chronology of the war, realizing that if you just trust our mantra for this film was always, it's complicated. Right? It's complicated. And filmmakers are notorious. You get a good scene and it's working and you don't want to fuss with it. A new fact or a complicating fact is you kind of go, grr, I don't want to touch this. This one, we welcomed it. We relished it. So rather than sort of consciously taking aim and pot shots at these myths, we knew that by going through and engaging 24 scholars and many veterans, and those scholarship is across the spectrum of scholarship and even politics, historians from the various war colleges and West Points, as well as veterans of different points of view. We insisted on having it not just once, but dozens of junctures, maybe not dozens of junctures, but many, many junctures along the course of this production permitted us to not so much explode or debunk, but just sort of widen the lens on these events like the Gulf of Tonkin, like, as you were pointing out, the relative popularity of the war. I mean, in 1970, May of 1970, when the 4 Kent State students were shot and to death and others wounded, 57% of the American public thought that the National Guardsmen, who had acted so irresponsibly, had acted responsibly. Yeah. And there were death threats and horrible letters sent to the parents of one of the students who was just an ROTC guy walking by and got killed. And they said he deserves to be dead. He was just another communist. So you begin to see that, when we lament and wring our hands about today and the sort of the sense that our tapestry, our magnificent tapestry has been frayed. Yes, it has, but you can find antecedents. And maybe we should have started this conversation in a different way, Ed. Maybe I could have said, hey, Ed, I've been working for over a decade on a film about mass demonstrations taking place across the country against the current administration, about a White House in disarray, obsessed with leaks, about a president absolutely sure that the media is lying and making up stories, about an asymmetrical war in which the mighty might of the U.S. military is having a hard time figuring out how to attend to it, about a huge document drop of stolen classified material that's dumped into the public sphere that destabilizes the national conversation, and accusations that a political campaign reached out to a foreign power during a national election to help them influence that election. You'd say, geez, Ken, you've abandoned historical study. You're talking about the present moment. But those 6 things are only a handful of the dozens and dozens of things that sort of echo, that rhyme, Mark Twain might have said, that are motifs and themes within this film about Vietnam. None that we consciously set about collecting, but ones that appear there because human nature remains the same. And our response as human beings, not just Americans, will remain the same. We could go back and find things in the Civil War that resonate with this moment. Indeed, in fact, it seems like, as the last words of our Civil War series, it's not only still being fought, but could be lost, ring true just in the last few weeks of events issuing from Charlottesville.
Yeah, it certainly is an interesting and compelling time to be in the field of history, as you just related.
In fact, I think it gives us a kind of unique perspective and also a kind of armor. I remember when during the 2008-09 financial meltdown, people that I knew, friends, journalists, even people in the financial world would say, this is a depression, this is a depression. And I said, no, it's not. In the depression, in one day, 1/4 of the state of Mississippi went on the auction block. If that happens, it'll be a depression. In the depression, in many American cities, the animals in the zoo were shot and the meat distributed to the poor. If that happens, I might admit we're in a depression, but those things haven't happened. So let's just breathe. And I think history arms you in a particular way to help you understand and see this dynamic moment. You know, there were hundreds and hundreds of bombings around the United States. Bombings.
Yep.
People were blown up. People died. Buildings were blown up. Offices were blown up. And hundreds of them. Today, we live in a media example which explodes and multiplies each individual event so much that we think, oh, this is the worst time ever. Well, it's not, actually. And we still haven't brought up the Civil War as any corresponding thing. We murdered 750,000, we now know, thanks to Drew Gilp and Faust's scholarship, of ourselves over this issue of slavery. And, you know, one unfortunate woman has died in Charlottesville, and I'm sure there are many African Americans would say every day one of us is shot by the police, which is a continuation of this. But we're not in open rebellion.
Right. One of my go-to lines, as I say, is history can help keep you sane, because it is so easy to think that this is the worst of times. And it doesn't mean it's not a difficult time and one, you know, laced with peril, but having a perspective is, I think, one of the most important, instructive or helpful aspects of knowing a little history.
I agree. You know, I do a lot of public speaking, and people always wring their hands, you know, and say, we live in such complicated times. As I said, all times are complicated. And they said, well, we just wish you could go back to the good old days. I said, what's that? It can't be, you know, pre-1863, right? You can't have slavery on the books, or 1865 when the 13th Amendment is passed. Well, what period is the best period you'd like? And you say, well, you know, the 30s or the 40s. And you go, wait a second.
Yeah.
You know, the 30s had the greatest economic dislocation in the history of the world, and the 40s had the greatest cataclysm in the history of the world. How come that? We live in simpler times compared to that. So, you know, I think being armed, even with just a little bit of history, a popular history, which is, you know, the books that most people read or the television shows that most people watch, it can be incredibly helpful, but not just for oneself, but for, as I'm suggesting, this ability to stitch ourselves or restitch ourselves together as a community and understand, although civics is a dirty word, how important it is, not just to say, oh, there are 100 senators and 435 representatives, and this is how you get this, and the judiciary works this way, but this is how you get things done. This is how you work with other people. This is how things are accomplished. This is how you move forward. This is how you compromise. This is how you do things together. And that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, the word compromise is a good example where people feel that it's very important these days to not compromise 1 inch, when in fact compromise has long been a kind of a central tool in our democratic toolbox.
I asked Shelby Foote why the Civil War happened in an interview that I conducted with him in 1985 or 86. And he said, Americans like to think of themselves as uncompromising people, but our genius is for compromise. And when that broke down, the Civil War happened.
Indeed. Well, we only have a few more minutes left here. I wanted to ask you one question, and this may be impossible to answer given the scope of this project on the Vietnam War, but is there one moment or one scene in the war that stands out for you as really kind of encapsulating that tension and that conflict, or maybe something else, maybe something larger about American history?
Well, I couldn't lay a finger on it. This is why, I love to do what I do. I feel like I've got the best job in the country. It educates all my parts. But, the experiences of working in this film was such a privilege. A Gold Star mother doesn't have to relive the worst day of her life. And yet we have a Gold Star mother that does. And it's an extraordinary gift, not just to us and the film that we've made, but to everyone else. And not just people who have experienced grief, so that would be primarily who it could be helpful for, but to all of us to try to understand in an individualistic way what the cost of war is. We have another Marine who's almost in every episode of the film who goes through such extraordinary changes that just following him along, he becomes, one of these central pillars. To have access to the intimacy of the presidential tapes that were made under Johnson and Nixon, tapes for which they still haven't fully transcribed or listened to all of them, is a revelation. I think the audience will be stunned by that. And what it does is it takes the usual abstract top-down view of history and makes it the same as the bottom-up. If you can hear the angst and anxiety of Lyndon Johnson worrying about committing troops, regardless of what he's saying in public,
right,
you begin to understand how he and we were torn on that bias, both psychologically as well as, in that realm of public policy. That's wonderful. And I think there's no one thing as much as it is the totality of the things we've tried to work into this film.
That's why, in some ways, as I was asking the question, I realized maybe this is, not an easy question to answer. and the one thing I wanted to hit on before we conclude here is your take on the Vietnam Memorial. It is a story that's so incredible, from the conception of, who the person behind it, and then the architect chosen, and then the intense opposition to it. And then how so many, I don't think everybody, but so many people have done a 180 on that in a way where it's become this incredibly, probably one of the most sacred spaces in the United States.
I would agree with your last comment there. It is one of the most sacred spaces. This is what we want from art, is it not? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is certainly, I know, within my field of documentary filmmaking and filmmaking in general, but also obviously in sculpture and in memorial. What you want is for 1 and 1 to equal 3. Our normal rational selves will say, no, 1 and 1 is always 2, don't get that wrong. But what we look for in our faith and in our love and relationships in so many parts of our lives is that improbable calculus where 1 and 1 equals 3. And the Vietnam Wall is a huge character in our film. You see it from the very first episode, and we return to it in almost every episode as a kind of touchstone, kind of illustrating sometimes the death of someone we just met or some other thing, and nothing is explained until, 3/4, 80% of the way through the very last episode in which we tell the story of the wall. And there are moments in that when some of the people we've met in the film start off the beginning of the sentence saying they did not like the wall. I thought it was blah, blah, blah. By the time they put a period at the end of their sentence, they're in tears.
Right.
And that, I think, is what the wall does. It basically short circuits that binary good, bad, yes, no, red state, blue state, for, against kind of relationship and says there might be something else involved. And I've spent my entire professional life trying to figure out what that something else is. And it's fleeting and it's ephemeral and you can't always get to it. But that wall is a great work of art. And because it's a great work of art, it is transcendent. And because it is transcendent, it makes it impossible to relate to it in a simple binary fashion. And that's what you hope all art can do, is help us get through these tough things in which clearly the binary is not working. If you're still having arguments with dad or with grandpa about this thing, it's not working. And can we try another approach? Can we see that every once in a while, 1 and 1 equals 3? And that's the value of art in our life, just as it is in our faith and in, as I said, our relationships and our love.
I agree wholeheartedly. And I think viewers are going to be stunned by what they see when the Vietnam War debuts on September 17th. So Ken Burns, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us at In the Past Lane, and best of luck with the film and all the events around it and all the conversations, which I think are going to be very rich, the ones you participated in and also the ones that you can be sure that you're generating just by putting this remarkable project together.
Thank you, Ed, for giving me the opportunity to have a conversation, but the ones that are going to be the most important are the ones that I'm not involved in. I'll be very happy if we thought that the film we've made has helped set some of those things in motion, but It's really going to be those conversations that people have around the dinner table or watching it together. And I urge everyone who is listening to watch it with somebody you love and use it as an occasion to hang on to each other, because it's at times not a fun story, but it's a necessary story. And I think that we can get through this and we can help our current moment.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Ken Burns is a highly acclaimed documentary filmmaker. His newest film, The Vietnam War, a 10-part, 18-hour series, co-directed by longtime partner Lynn Novick, begins airing on PBS on September 17th, 2017. Okay, people, that's all for this episode of In the Past Lane. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you like what you've heard, please subscribe to this podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you access your podcasts. And tell your friends about In the Past Lane. That really helps to bring in new listeners. For more information about the many things we talked about today, head over to our show page for this episode at inthepastlane.com. I also want to hear from you, so please send us your comments, questions, and suggestions via Twitter, Instagram, and our Facebook page. I'm In the Past Lane's host, Edward T. O'Donnell, your historian at large, reminding you that history explains our world. So let's pay attention to it. Thanks for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another journey in the Past Lane. Hey, Lulu, I got all that in just 39 takes. Not bad, huh?
I seriously need a new job.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.